September 1944, the banks of the Loire River in western France. A German major general named Botho Elster faces a nightmare scenario. He commands a massive column of nearly 20,000 troops, completely cut off, hundreds of miles behind the advancing American lines. They cannot escape to Germany. They cannot win. But they still have the weapons to turn the French countryside into a bloodbath. Elster makes a decision that defies the direct orders of Adolf Hitler. He prepares to surrender his entire force. But this isn't just any surrender. Elster is trapped in the operational sector of General George S. Patton. The world knows Patton as Old Blood and Guts, a commander famous for relentless aggression and a hatred of the enemy. But how Patton handles this massive capitulation will reveal a side of the legendary general that history books often ignore. A strategist who understood that sometimes strict military etiquette is deadlier than a tank. This is the story of the largest mass surrender to U.S. forces in Europe, and why Patton's controversial decision to honor a Nazi general ended up saving thousands of American lives. Before we reveal the details of this negotiation, ask yourself this: was this strict adherence to protocol an act of mercy? Or was it a psychological weapon designed to dismantle the German army from within? If you believe military history is defined by more than just battles, subscribe and join the discussion below. Do you think you would have granted these terms to an enemy who had occupied France for 4 years? Let's examine the facts. By mid-September, the situation for the German army in France was catastrophic. Following the Allied breakout from Normandy, Patton's Third Army had raced east at a speed that shocked both his enemies and his superiors. German defensive lines didn't just bend, they evaporated. Supply routes were severed. Entire garrisons were bypassed and left to rot as American armor drove deep toward the German border. General Elster commanded a marching group of stragglers left in that wake, a chaotic mix of occupation troops, sailors, and support staff. These men were trained to hold territory, not to fight a mobile war against the most mechanized army on earth. Now, the Loire River was at their backs, and Patton's tanks were blocking their retreat. Elster's situation was desperate. French resistance fighters were swarming the countryside, hunting down isolated German units with brutal efficiency. Allied aircraft dominated the skies, making movement suicidal. Elster had 3 options, and 2 of them led to a graveyard. He could fight and be annihilated. He could disperse and be hunted down by partisans. Or he could try to negotiate with the Americans. But to do that, he would have to ask George Patton for a favor. General Botho Elster stood at the precipice of a military disaster, commanding a force that existed on maps but had ceased to function as a cohesive army. His command consisted of nearly 20,000 men, a staggering number on paper. Yet these were not the elite panzer divisions that had blitzed across Europe years earlier. They were a mixed collection of regular army units, support personnel, and garrison troops, men trained to man checkpoints and hold territory, and not to fight a high-speed mobile war against American armored columns. Now, the geography of France had turned against them. The Loire River lay at their backs, a natural barrier that had transformed from a defensive line into a cage. To their front, the tanks of General Patton's Third Army controlled every major crossing point, effectively placing a wall of American steel between Elster's men and the German border. Above them, Allied aircraft dominated the skies, turning any attempt at large-scale movement into a suicidal venture. Steyr sat in his headquarters facing three distinct options, each one grimmer than the last. The first option was to obey standard military doctrine: attack. He could order his 20,000 men to fix bayonets and try to fight their way east to rejoin the main German lines. Militarily, this was impossible. His troops lacked the heavy weapons and transport necessary for offensive operations against a mechanized enemy. If they stepped out of cover, they would be spotted by Allied reconnaissance and destroyed by American air power long before they ever saw the German border. It would not be a battle. It would be a massacre. The second option was to dissolve the army. Steyr could order his units to disperse into the French countryside and conduct a campaign of guerrilla warfare. This might prolong the fighting and tie up American resources for a few weeks, but it would achieve nothing strategically. Furthermore, it would doom his men to a terrifying fate. Isolated and cut off from supply, they would be hunted down one by one, not just by American soldiers, but by French partisans seeking revenge for years of brutal occupation. To scatter his men was to sentence them to death in the woods of western France. This left the third option: surrender. In any other war, this would be the logical conclusion for a trapped force with zero strategic value. But for a German general in 1944, the word surrender was more complicated than it sounded. Adolf Hitler had made capitulation tantamount to treason. The orders from Berlin were clear: fight to the last man. Officers who capitulated faced summary execution if they ever fell back into German hands. Even worse, the consequences extended beyond the battlefield. Under the ruthless policies of the Nazi regime, the families of officers who surrendered could be punished for the crimes of their husbands and fathers. To wave the white flag was to risk the lives of his wife and children back home. Steyr was a professional soldier, not a Nazi fanatic. He looked at the map and saw the cold, hard reality of his situation. Continuing to fight would kill thousands of men, German and American alike, for absolutely no purpose. The rational decision was clear, but the cost of making it was personal destruction. He had to decide if he could make this choice without dishonoring himself as an officer or condemning his men to mistreatment at the hands of an enemy that had every reason to hate them. The lives of 20,000 men rested on whether one general was willing to commit treason against his own government to save them. With the decision made, General Steyr initiated the most dangerous phase of his operation, making contact with the enemy. He did not broadcast a general plea for mercy over the radio waves, nor did he simply raise a white flag and hope for the best. This was a calculated military maneuver, executed with the same precision as an offensive strike. Steyr dispatched intermediaries toward the American lines, men charged with crossing the deadly no-man's land that separated the trapped German column from Patton's advancing armor. The message these emissaries carried was blunt and transactional. Steyr was not offering a chaotic collapse. He was offering a controlled transfer of power. He informed the Americans that he commanded approximately 20,000 troops, a force the size of a small city, who were prepared to lay down their arms. But this offer came with strings attached. It was not an unconditional surrender, but a conditional capitulation based on specific, non-negotiable terms. Steyr demanded guarantees. His primary condition was that his men be treated strictly according to the Geneva Conventions. He required that the surrender be conducted with full military formality, officers to keep their sidearms during the transition, units to march in formation, and the hierarchy of command to remain intact until they were processed into captivity. This was not merely about pride, it was about survival. The urgency of Steur's request stemmed from a very specific fear: the French resistance. For 4 years, German occupation troops had held France in an iron grip, and now the grip was broken. Across the countryside, French partisans were exacting brutal revenge on isolated German units. Steur knew that if his men were captured by the French, or handed over to local forces, they would likely face summary execution or mob justice rather than a prisoner of war camp. Therefore, the core of Steur's proposal was a plea for American custody. He demanded assurance that his soldiers would not be handed over to French forces who had every reason to seek retribution. He wanted the protection of the United States Army, relying on the reputation of American forces for adhering to international law. The intermediaries delivered this high-stakes proposal to the forward elements of the U.S. Third Army. The request traveled up the chain of command, moving from the muddy front lines to the operational headquarters. It was a staggering proposition. An entire enemy division willing to remove itself from the war without firing a shot, provided the Americans agreed to play by the rules. The offer landed on the desks of Patton's staff, presenting them with a situation that required immediate attention from the Army commander himself. The German general had played his card. Now he waited to see if the Americans would accept the deal or continue the slaughter. The proposal from General Elster landed like a grenade in the headquarters of the U.S. Third Army. It was a deviation from the established rhythm of the war, where victory was usually measured in yards gained and enemies killed. Now, a German general was asking to dictate the terms of his own defeat. When Patton's staff reviewed the conditions, the initial reaction among some officers was resistance. The Allied policy, solidified years earlier, was unconditional surrender. The idea of negotiating with a Wehrmacht commander, giving him assurances, promising protection, and treating his capitulation as a formal military transfer rather than a total collapse, rankled those who believed the only proper response to a Nazi force was its total destruction or absolute submission. Why, they argued, should the Third Army offer guarantees to a defeated enemy who had occupied France for 4 years? Why not simply demand they drop their weapons or face annihilation? But George Patton viewed the battlefield through a different lens. While his public image was that of a brash brawler, his private command decisions were often driven by a cold, pragmatic intellect. Patton looked at the situation and saw a mathematical certainty that his subordinates missed. 20,000 German soldiers were currently dug in, armed, and desperate. If Patton denied their request and demanded unconditional surrender, he backed them into a corner. A cornered enemy, believing they face humiliation, torture, or execution, has no reason to stop pulling the trigger. They would fight to the death, not for victory, but for the sake of dying with a weapon in their hands. Clearing them out would require air strikes, artillery barrages, and infantry assaults. It would cost fuel, time, and ammunition, resources Patton needed for his drive toward Germany. More importantly, it would cost American lives. Patton realized that Elster was offering him a gift, the removal of an entire enemy division from the war board without the expenditure of a single American bullet. Accepting the German terms cost the United States nothing but a promise to follow the laws it had already signed. But there was a deeper strategic calculation at play in Patton's mind. He understood that the war in France was not just being fought with tanks, it was being fought with information. If he crushed Elster's force after they offered to surrender, every other German unit in France would get the message. The Americans are merciless. Fight to the end. Conversely, if he accepted the surrender and treated these men with professional dignity, a different message would permeate the German lines. Patton knew that how he treated a surrendering enemy today would dictate whether the next enemy chose to surrender tomorrow. He wasn't just solving a tactical problem at the Loire River. He was manufacturing a psychological weapon to be used against every other German commander in Europe. Patton overruled the dissenters. He issued the order to accept General Elster's terms. He directed his subordinates to handle the operation strictly according to the laws of war. There were to be no special favors, but there was to be no degradation either. The Germans were to be treated as legitimate prisoners of war, entitled to protection under international conventions. The order went down the chain of command: hold fire, prepare reception areas, treat the enemy with the formal respect due to professional soldiers. Patton had made his choice. He traded the immediate satisfaction of crushing a helpless foe for the long-term strategic advantage of breaking the enemy's will to fight. The message was sent back to Elster. The Americans accepted. The surrender was on. To the average infantryman on the line, Patton's decision might have looked like leniency. And after years of brutal combat, watching friends die at the hands of the Wehrmacht, the order to treat 20,000 German soldiers with professional courtesy was a bitter pill to swallow. But inside the command tent, this was not about mercy. It was about cold, hard mechanics. Patton understood a fundamental paradox of warfare that many of his peers ignored. The harder you press a defeated enemy, the harder they fight. If a German commander believed that surrender meant humiliation, torture, or a firing squad, he had no incentive to stop shooting. He would dig in, fight to the last round, and take as many Americans with him as possible. Desperation creates fanatics. By accepting General Elster's terms, Patton was effectively removing that desperation from the equation. He was broadcasting a message that was far more powerful than an artillery barrage. The message was simple: the Americans follow the rules. If you fight us, we will destroy you. But if you stop, you will survive. This calculation transformed the Geneva Conventions from a set of humanitarian guidelines into a strategic weapon. Patton realized that every German soldier who walked into a POW camp was one less soldier his men had to dig out of a bunker. Every unit that capitulated peacefully was a town that didn't have to be leveled, a bridge that didn't have to be blown, and a platoon of Americans who got to go home to their families. The logic extended beyond the immediate tactical situation at the Loire River. Patton knew that news traveled fast, even in a chaotic war zone. He knew that if these 20,000 men were treated correctly, they would write letters home. They would talk to new prisoners. Rumors would filter back across the lines through the mysterious osmosis of the battlefield. If the story spreading through the German ranks was one of American brutality, resistance would stiffen. But if the story was that General Elster had marched 20,000 men into captivity and was treated like an officer, other German commanders, men who were tired, cut off, and disillusioned with Hitler's war, would see a viable exit strategy. Patton was essentially engaging in psychological warfare, using honor as the payload. He was creating a permission structure for German officers to choose survival over suicide. He recognized that professional soldiers, even enemy ones, often operated on a code of logic. If the logic of surrender led to honorable captivity, they would take it. If it led to abuse, they would reject it. This was strategic sophistication operating at a level most observers never credited to old blood and guts. While the press focused on his pearl-handled revolvers and his profane speeches, Patton was applying a nuanced understanding of human nature to the battlefield. He saw that the most efficient way to destroy an enemy army wasn't always to kill every man in it. Sometimes it was to give them a reason to quit. The decision to approve Elster's surrender wasn't an act of forgiveness for the crimes of the Nazi regime. It was a pragmatic maneuver designed to accelerate the collapse of the German military in the West. By validating Elster's request, Patton was investing in a future where German units would look for the white flag before they looked for the Panzerfaust. He was banking on the idea that a reputation for fairness was worth more than the temporary satisfaction of revenge. And as the events of September 1944 would soon prove, his calculation was entirely correct. On September 16th, 1944. The roads near the Loire River became the stage for one of the most surreal spectacles of the European theater. Under the gray skies of western France, a massive column of nearly 20,000 German soldiers emerged from their defensive positions, not as a scattered rabble fleeing from an artillery barrage, but as a cohesive military entity. They moved in formation, an entire division plus supporting units, marching in step toward the American lines. To the American observers watching through binoculars, the discipline of the enemy force was striking. These men were not behaving like a defeated mob or a collection of desperate stragglers. They remained organized, maintaining the structure of their battalions and regiments even in the moment of their final defeat. At the head of this vast column stood General Botho Elster and his staff officers, walking directly toward the positions of the U.S. Third Army to execute the agreement they had brokered. The meeting point was tense, but devoid of the violence that had characterized the campaign in France since D-Day. U.S. Army units, operating under General Patton's direct command authority, stood ready to accept the surrender. There was no chaotic rush to loot the enemy or exact vengeance for the months of bitter fighting. Instead, the process unfolded with the rigid precision of a drill ground exercise. The surrender was conducted strictly according to military protocol. General Elster formally announced the capitulation of his command to the American officers present. The American commanders, adhering to Patton's strategic directive, accepted the surrender with professional stoicism. This was the critical moment where the agreement could have collapsed into bloodshed, yet the Americans held their discipline as firmly as the Germans held their formation. The disarmament process began immediately. Thousands of German rifles, machine guns, and sidearms were surrendered, effectively neutralizing a force that had threatened the flank of the Allied advance. The German troops were then organized and processed for transport to prisoner-of-war camps. For the individual German soldier, this was the moment of maximum danger and maximum relief. Many had marched toward the American lines with the propaganda of the Nazi regime ringing in their ears, fearing that surrender was merely a prelude to execution or abuse. Instead, they encountered a startling reality. The American soldiers processing them acted firmly, securing the prisoners without hesitation, but they treated them correctly. There were no mass executions, there was no gauntlet of abuse. Instead, the surrendering troops found themselves being fed, a luxury many had not experienced in weeks. Those who were wounded or sick were not left to die on the roadside, but were given medical attention. They were processed through established prisoner-of-war procedures, registered, and detained exactly as international law required. General Elster and his officers were treated not as criminals, but as enemy combatants who had chosen an honorable exit from a hopeless war. The distinction was subtle, but enormous. By treating Elster as a professional soldier, rather than a traitor or a monster, the Americans validated his decision to spare his men. The scene at the Loire River stood in stark contrast to the fears that had permeated the German ranks. Patton's forces had not offered charity. They had simply adhered to the laws of war. Yet, in doing so, they had achieved a total victory. An entire army had vanished from the battlefield, processed into captivity without a single shot being fired in anger during the transition. As the trucks loaded with prisoners began to move out, the message was already clear. The Americans had kept their word. The surrender at the Loire River did not end when the last German boot crossed into the holding area. In the days following the capitulation of General Elster's 20,000 men, a new dynamic began to take hold across the Western Front, one that was far more subtle than the movement of armored divisions, but equally devastating to the German war effort. News of the event traveled with a speed that defied the collapsing German infrastructure. While official lines of communication were being severed by Allied bombers and French partisans, the informal grapevine of the soldiery remained intact. Word spread through the Wehrmacht communication networks, fragmented and chaotic as they were, carrying a story that contradicted everything the Nazi propaganda machine had been screaming for years. The story was simple but revolutionary. A German general had surrendered an entire army to the Americans, and everyone had survived. There had been no massacres in the ditches of France. There had been no revenge killings by angry GUIS. The officers were being treated with the professional courtesy due their rank, and the enlisted men were being fed and housed according to international law. This intelligence hit the German lines with the force of a psychological bombshell. For months, German troops had been told that surrender meant death or humiliation. Now they had concrete proof that there was another option. The stark contrast between the honorable captivity of Elster's men and the terrifying uncertainty of continuing the fight created a fracture in the German will to resist. American intelligence officers soon began to notice a distinct pattern emerging in the weeks after the Loire surrender. Across France, German units that found themselves in similar predicaments, cut off, low on ammunition, and devoid of strategic hope, began to behave differently. Instead of fighting to the last round or dispersing into the woods to wage a futile guerrilla war, commanders were reaching out. Specific requests began to filter through the lines during surrender negotiations. German officers were not just asking to surrender, they were specifically asking to surrender to American forces. In their parleys, they explicitly cited the treatment of General Elster's force as the precedent. They wanted the same deal. They knew the Americans followed the laws of war, and that reputation became the currency that bought their capitulation. The strategic value of this shift was immense. Every time a battalion or regiment-sized force laid down its arms without a fight, it saved the U.S. Army time, fuel, and blood. Every garrison that walked out of its bunkers with hands raised was a piece of territory secured without the need for a costly assault. Patton's decision to honor the surrender terms of one general was now paying dividends across the entire theater. By validating the rational choice of surrender, he had given enemy commanders permission to stop fighting when the situation was hopeless. The cumulative effect of these subsequent surrenders shortened the campaign in France and accelerated the Allied push toward the German border. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. If Patton had chosen to humiliate Elster, or if American troops had taken vengeance on the 20,000 prisoners at the Loire, the German army would have received a very different message. You have nothing to lose, so take as many of them with you as you can. Instead, the message was, the war is lost, but your life is not. This was the weaponization of military honor. By strictly adhering to the Geneva Conventions, Patton's forces had dismantled the enemy's resolve more effectively than an artillery barrage. The surrender of September 16th had been a logistical triumph, but its aftermath was a strategic masterstroke that saved countless American lives by convincing the enemy that peace was a viable alternative to death. For General Botho Elster, the war ended quietly. After the formal ceremonies at the Loire River, he and his staff were processed through the standard channels of the American prisoner of war system. He spent the remainder of the conflict in captivity, detained in American camps, where he was separated from his enlisted men, but provided with the conditions appropriate to his rank. By all accounts, he conducted himself as a cooperative, professional officer who had made a difficult but necessary command decision. He was detained, not abused, guarded, not degraded. But when the guns finally fell silent in Europe and the Third Reich collapsed into ash, Elster faced a different kind of reckoning. Upon his return to post-war Germany, he was not greeted as a savior who had preserved the lives of 20,000 husbands and fathers. Instead, he was met with a criminal indictment. The German government put him on trial for the surrender of his command. The shadow of the Nazi regime cast a long darkness, even after its political dissolution. Under the draconian military laws that had governed the Wehrmacht, capitulation without fighting to the last man was not a tactical option. It was a capital crime. The code was explicit. Surrender was tantamount to desertion or treason. By the strict letter of the regulations he had sworn to uphold, Elster had betrayed his country by refusing to lead his men into a suicidal slaughter. The trial forced a confrontation between the fanaticism of the fallen regime and the cold reality of the battlefield. The court had to determine whether a commander's duty was to die for a lost cause or to preserve the lives of his men when victory was mathematically impossible. The evidence was the map itself, cut off, outnumbered, outgunned, and hunted by a vengeance-seeking resistance. The post-war German court looked at the facts of September 1944. They recognized what Patton had recognized. Elster's situation had been hopeless. Continuing to fight would have accomplished nothing strategically. It would only have added thousands of corpses to the tally of a war that was already lost. The tribunal concluded that Elster's decision to surrender had been the only rational choice available to a sane commander. Elster was pardoned. The legal vindication allowed him to live out the rest of his life quietly in post-war Germany, a man who had chosen life over glory. Yet, whenever the subject of the surrender was raised, Elster maintained a consistent position regarding why the event had happened at all. He always acknowledged one specific factor that made his decision possible: the conduct of the American forces. Elster was clear in his retrospect. If he had believed that capitulation meant execution, torture, or humiliation, he would not have surrendered. He would have felt compelled to fight on, not because he expected to win, but because military honor would have demanded resistance against a barbaric enemy. If the Americans had been the monsters that Nazi propaganda claimed, Elster would have ordered his 20,000 men to die fighting them. It was the professional treatment he received from Patton's Third Army that gave him the ability to make the rational choice. Because the Americans followed the laws of war, Elster was able to follow the dictates of reason. The trial proved that his decision was legally sound, but history proved that it was Patton's adherence to military honor that allowed the decision to be made in the first place. The surrender of General Botho Elster stands as one of the largest single capitulations of German forces to the U.S. Army in World War II. Nearly 20,000 soldiers were removed from the combat map in a single afternoon without a single round of ammunition being expended. While the sheer scale of the event makes it a statistical anomaly, its true significance lies not in the numbers, but in what it reveals about the nature of military leadership and the strategic value of honor. George Patton is etched into the public consciousness as the archetype of the aggressive warrior, a man who lived for the attack and famously despised the very idea of defense. But the Elster surrender illuminates a dimension of his command philosophy that was far more sophisticated than his blood and guts caricature suggests. Patton understood that the ultimate goal of warfare is not merely to kill the enemy, but to break their will to resist. He recognized that while tanks and artillery could destroy a physical army, only psychology could dismantle a fighting force from the inside out. Patton grasped a concept in 1944 that modern military doctrine would later codify as a cornerstone of counterinsurgency and psychological warfare. The way you treat a defeated enemy determines how long the remaining enemies will fight. By strictly adhering to the Geneva Conventions, Patton transformed the laws of war from a set of bureaucratic constraints into a high-yield strategic weapon. He proved that respect, when applied with calculation and discipline, accomplishes more than bullets. This was not a decision born of weakness or sentimentality. Patton hated the Nazi ideology and showed no mercy to SS units or political fanatics. However, he respected the professional soldier, regardless of the uniform, and he understood the transactional nature of survival. He knew that if he backed a rational commander like Elster into a corner with no hope of honorable exit, he would create a desperate battle where none needed to exist. By ensuring that the honorable option was real, Patton gave the Germans a reason to stop shooting. The legacy of the Loire River surrender is a lesson that transcends the specific context of World War II. It demonstrates that in the chaos of conflict, The most effective commanders are not always the ones who are the most ruthless. Sometimes victory belongs to those who understand that discipline, law, and professional conduct are weapons as lethal as any explosive. Patton's decision saved American lives not by fighting, but by protecting the enemy long enough for them to quit. This story challenges the modern perception of what total war looks like. It suggests that even in a struggle as absolute as the fight against Nazi Germany, there was room and indeed a strategic necessity for the rigid application of military law. The 20,000 men who marched into captivity instead of dying in the French mud are the silent testament to a simple, powerful truth. Sometimes the hardest decision a general can make is to holster his weapon and accept a handshake. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden strategies of World War II, hit that subscribe button right now. We are building a library of the most critical, overlooked moments in military history, and we want you on the front lines with us. Does Patton's decision change your view of his leadership? Or was he just lucky that Elster was a rational man? Let us know in the comments below.